Welcome to this week's episode of Compliance Deconstructed, brought to you by Jessica Zeff, Elvan Baker, and Lorie Davis. This week's topic, if you can take it, we're going to talk about board responsibilities and fiduciary duties. It's a cool topic. There's a lot to it. Elvan's got the giggles today. I'm just warning you all, but
I
we
do.
can grin and bear it. See? All right. So we're ready.
Expect
So-
Lorie to roll her eyes at Elvan at a frequency of every other minute.
Seriously, listeners out there today, we're having a good time. There are 3 women in the world who have had their coffee this morning and are ready to go. So with that, first of all, let's talk a little bit about what does it mean fiduciary duty? Well, let's back up a little bit. So when you work in healthcare compliance, not just healthcare compliance, but when you, let's say, have a business or a corporation or even a not-for-profit, most organizations, or I should say many of them, will have a board of directors. And this board of directors acts in an advisory capacity to the organization. What a lot of people, I don't think, realize is that the board has something called fiduciary duties. And what are these duties? A lot of people think, oh, the board is there. Who knows what they do? It's a nice social event. It builds social capital. It looks good on a resume. Actually, there's a lot more going on with a board, and they have quite a few responsibilities when they're put into a board position. And we talk about these things called fiduciary duties. What are they? That's what we're going to flesh out today. And we're going to flesh out how do these fiduciary duties, how do they dovetail with compliance responsibilities? And what does that look like? What responsibilities and obligations does that put on the board in terms of compliance? And how does the compliance officer then interact with the board? So on that note, let's first kick off and make sure that we understand what this means, fiduciary duty. So there really are 3 parts of fiduciary duty, if you want to call it that. So we start with a duty of care. And that simply means that board members need to make informed decisions about the organization's business with the same care that a reasonably prudent person would use. Now, what does that mean? Who's a reasonably prudent person? Well, anyone who's really a professional and who has the experience, but it also means attending board meetings, being prepared for those board meetings, having some expertise and professionalism, something that you can contribute to the board, to the running of the stewardship of the organization, asking questions and challenging assumptions and being able to rely on accurate data and information in order to make informed decision and provide appropriate guidance to the organization. Right. What else can I say, Lorie and Elvan? What else have we got around duty of care?
I actually wanted to back out just one little bit before we get into that. I want the listeners to hear that this applies not just to board members anywhere and everywhere. This applies to you. And I think what you said, Jessica, resonates with me, even with my past thinking process where I thought board members are there, everything is prepared for them, they show up to a meeting and they get this pretty package of everything is laid out. They're kind of there as the people to say, yep, how was your golf tournament? That was great. How was yours? That's great. And everything is running smoothly. If it's the company is not in the red, or there is nothing blaring in the news about us, we're good to go. Okay, we move on. I want the listeners to think and understand that, because there are also jobs out there with board membership, is that there is a lot of responsibility that is on you when you become a board member. So hopefully our episode today will give a good framework of understanding what those responsibilities are. And because it's not just a fancy title to show up somewhere, it's just you have a lot of duties, and those duties are not always black and white. And you have to ask a lot of internal questions and have solid answers within your compass, ethical compass.
I
Sorry.
think that's a really good point. No, it's really good. So I'm going to go quickly. I think the duty of care is the duty
Mhm.
that comes up we hear in conversation the most. So I wanted to touch on that
Yes.
first. Um, the other two duties, let's move on a little bit quickly and then we'll get into our discussion, right? So, in addition to a duty of care, there's a duty of loyalty. And really, what that means is that, the board members have to be careful they don't have a conflict of interest with their position and with their responsibilities in directing or stewarding the organization. And they have a responsibility for disclosing their conflicts of interest. And that's why when you're in compliance, board members are asked, can you disclose any conflicts of interest that you have? So giving a little bit of maybe some understanding of where some of these questions are coming up from the compliance team. And the last duty is a duty of obedience. And it's not quite what you think, but it is about making sure that the organization follows its mission and its bylaws and applicable laws and regulations. So it's not that the board members necessarily have to be obedient, but as they're stewarding the organization that they're responsible for, they need to have some sort of oversight of regulatory issues and also the company's own policies, procedures, rules, internal rules, right? And they're partly responsible for making sure that the company follows all of that framework. Okay. So just running through, board members have a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, and a duty of obedience. Just throwing this out there. Ladies, do you think most board members know or really understand that they've got these duties?
I'm going to guess 2 out of 3, unless they're very well experienced and they've been through a lawsuit or two.
Okay, well, what do you think they're aware of? What makes you say that?
The way that I see it is that duty of obedience falls more to the operations within the organization and not necessarily to the board members. Meaning, let's say that this is a healthcare organization and you have lots of, business people within the system as well as the clinician, and that's the intersection, right? That as a healthcare company, I feel that more board members will feel that people who are delivering the services or customer facing have more of that duty of obedience than they themselves. Meaning, if the field is doing the right thing, then that portion is fulfilled, that it doesn't fall on them. This is just an intuition and an opinion. What do you think, Lorie?
So I'm going to agree that in general, I do not think that boards are well educated on their duties and what that means. I think but I also think that that onus falls back on the compliance officer and the senior leadership team. The compliance officer needs to communicate out, hey, when we're talking to the board, do they understand why we're asking them to take compliance training? Do they understand why we're asking them to disclose their conflicts of interest? So I think we as compliance professionals need to own some of that and educate them, give them the OIG links where they can go take heat training or something like that where they can educate themselves. But I think in general, there is a lack of appreciation for what it means to serve on a board when it comes to the compliance side of the house. I think they get their oversight and their accountability to the senior level, the C-suite, so to speak. But I think where it falls down is on the compliance half of the house.
And I would agree with that. I mean, in my experience, I mean, how many times have you been in a position where you're asked to minimize the compliance training or you have to hunt down board members to get a conflict of interest, right? And you're being audited. Someone's coming and asking you and saying, hey, we want to see the training, we want to see the conflicts of interest. We want to see the privacy training. We want to see all of these things. We want to see the minutes of the meetings. We want to know what the relationship is like between the compliance officer and the board. And that information is very hard to get. And I don't know whether the board members themselves see it as a burden. They have to fill out some
Mm,
paperwork or they have to do training, or if that's something about the organization itself and how they perceive the board and the organization. The senior leadership is saying, oh, we don't want to give them too much work. They already do enough and they have busy lives.
Yeah.
And I'd say there's some responsibility for the compliance officer, but from experience, that can be tough. I'm going to push back a little bit on Lorie
Yeah, that's
on
fair.
what you said, because although I think the compliance officer has an obligation to try, there's only sometimes the organization, there is pushback and it doesn't allow you to get to the board in the way that you need to. You don't have
Yeah.
the access
Yeah.
to the board that you need in order to do your job or provide that education. So
Yeah.
there's a real tension there.
I agree. I think, but in my mind, if you're getting that pushback, I think it also comes down to good documentation. Hey, I attempted to
hmm
communicate this. I attempted to educate, and this is what the outcome. Keep copies of those emails, because when they come knocking, your paper trail is your best defense. So I don't disagree with you, but I do think that you have an obligation to speak up and say, "Hey, board, this is what I need you to know from a compliance perspective." But if you get that block by the C-suite and things like that, I think you still need to document that you made that attempt in good faith.
Hmm.
Agreed with both of those. And I was going to say one little blip that there's a bit of a flaw in this board of directors or advisory board members template that we have in many businesses. Healthcare is the same. Is the what makes a board member well qualified to serve on that board are the exact experiences that create the conflict of interest and that creates their not necessarily lack of knowledge of these three duties, but their lack of not self pressuring. Why? You want a board member who's well experienced in the industry. You want a board member who has hands on experience, hopefully in the sector that they're going to serve. You want a board member who has been a board member, so they're experienced as a board member, not just as a hands-on operator maybe or an owner. So if you want those things, those people come at number one at a cost, number two, but also at a cost of certain type of personality.
Yep.
So that's where we see the C-suite people push back on the compliance officers saying, like what Jess said, oh, they're busy. Oh, it's not that big of a deal that they're still that their board membership here is overlapping with our competitor. We see those things, and again, it's not from the desire to do something unethical. It just comes from a desire because the template is flawed. What makes a person so qualified are the exact reasons what makes it hard to accomplish all of these little tasks for them to be a well-informed board member. I mean, I
Yeah,
don't know if
they
you.
only have a limited amount of time. They're there to contribute a certain kind of expertise. And I guess, like so many of the topics we've covered, there's always a bit of a balance. There's a juggle, right? Or a tension. Like we sometimes talk about compliance, not we, like us on this podcast, but as a sector, as a profession, we talk about compliance almost in a vacuum because we have to, right? But we understand that in life, there are pressures, there are different pressures, right, that impact the work that we do and impact compliance. And I totally get it. I understand. So, for those of you who are dealing with your board members, we're not saying there's no perfect scenario. You're always going to have some pressures. And we'd like to explore some of that. That's part of this
Mhm.
podcast and how you may be able to approach some of those conversations and some of those tensions.
Mhm.
And to just talk about, so where does this concept of fiduciary duty come from? Well, it does come, it's in the law, it's in business law, but also, to be fair, and I have props this morning. To be fair, for those of you who are familiar with measuring compliance program effectiveness put out by the OIG, for those of you who can't see, I've got
Oh, we can all see it.
I'm holding it up.
Love that document.
It does. But for those
It's
of
under
us,
Lorie's pillow at nighttime.
It is. It is. It's the first thing
we're
I see
nerds.
every morning.
Yeah, just so you guys know, we're total nerds and we're proud of it. So
Epic.
in this guidance, there is actually a section around boards, and I had it very nicely marked down before my pen fell out. But it does say, it talks about the involvement of the board, and it talks about, it talks about the board of directors. And it says, under compliance program administration, element 2, we're looking for active board members, that the board has understanding and oversight of their responsibilities. They have appropriate escalation. There's a commitment from this board, and there's a process for escalating and accountability, so that when there's a problem, the board can challenge and the board can hold the organization accountable. So just so you know, it's not just in the law, but your compliance folks and your compliance professionals are asking because the OIG in its resource guide has said, hey, wait a minute. In particular, we want to know how the board operates. And in case that's not enough, we also have the General Compliance Program guidance from, again, our wonderful Office of the Inspector General, right? And again, it talks about board responsibilities. If you look at page, let's see, 43 of this document, it talks about compliance oversight. And it really gives a lot of good information about what's expected for the board. So for those of you that don't have a copy, I'm going to be a little bit boring for the moment. And I'm going to read you what it says. Ladies, brace yourselves. Boards should pay attention to the Commission's guidelines. This is the United States Sentencing Commission's guidelines that talks about an organization's governing authority, the board. So this is the rules and regulations are coming from the United States Sentencing Guidelines. And the OIG is talking about those guidelines by saying, corporate boards have a fiduciary duty of care, which requires that boards assure that, quote, information and reporting systems exist in the organization that are reasonably designed to provide to senior management and to the board itself timely, accurate information to allow the management and the board, each within its scope, to reach informed judgments. So I'm not going to read any more because I don't want anyone falling asleep on me. But actually, that's a really important line in the guidance. It gives a very clear steer about what the board is expected, what information they're expected to have, and how they're supposed to respond. All right. What are you thinking, Elvan?
Should we print these out and send them anonymously to board? How much would it cost per page is what I'm thinking.
That's the thing. Like in my entire career, it's been 25 years. It's been very few and far between that I have found a board that really understands. I would almost understand if the board hadn't heard of the 7 elements of compliance. Should they have? Maybe. That's arguable. I try to be a realist. They might not have. Fiduciary duties, I expect them to have understood because that's common not just in healthcare, but across organizations. And yet, board after board, I don't see that knowledge. I don't necessarily see a true understanding of their role or those fiduciary duties, let alone compliance.
And
right?
I hate to say it, like, where do we, because I know pretty soon we're going to start talking about, okay, do they know that they can be held personally liable for things that failed that should have been? And I hate to say that because yet again, we are pulling the conversation of compliance to a level of consequence, but the board members are supposed to be above that. They shouldn't be, the need should not be there to threaten them with personal liability. But yet again, that's what we're saying. I know that's what we're gonna say, you know.
But I think it's an indicator, though, of the state of
Correct.
current events, because you talked about personal responsibility. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
great point, because I was going to raise the Caremark case and the cases that came after. And for those of you who don't know, the Caremark case was a landmark in case law. And why is that? Because for the first time, the court found that directors, the executive directors of a board, can be held personally liable if they fail to make a good faith effort to oversee compliance and risk management. How many board members in healthcare do you think know that?
Mm. Mm-mm.
Yeah, I don't think very
Mm-mm.
many
Mm-mm.
board directors understand they can be held personally accountable. So we have all of these things. We have this concept of fiduciary duty, which extends across sectors, right? We have this, if we're talking about compliance in the healthcare sector, we have the OIG guidance and the resource manual, right? And then we have this Caremark line of cases. And I think what that speaks to is exactly what we're saying, that boards in general aren't necessarily prepared for the roles that they have. And there are some good reasons for that, right? There are tensions. They have a limited amount of time. They're not usually paid for the work, right? Maybe they get some sort of something, but they're not paid. It's not a paid job, right? They do this for other reasons. And I'm going to assume they do it because they want to share their experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there are tensions. And so, how do you get around some of this? Like, how do we get around? And one of the things, I suppose, it's hard to get around some of the tensions other than to acknowledge there is pressure there, right? You're never going to be able to walk in and say, hey, board members, you're all at this meeting. Great, fantastic. Let's have this exciting training on HIPAA. Yay. That's not how it's going to roll out, but there are many different approaches. And one of the things I think I'd first like to explore is training. Are there any good strategies for getting the board trained? And what would we train them on? Like, if we could do anything, how would we do our board training? What's important to cover? So, from my perspective, the first things I'd say is fraud, waste, and abuse, of course. And I'd want to say something about cybersecurity and HIPAA. I feel that fraud is probably a relevant topic across industries,
Mm-hmm.
and so is cybersecurity,
Mm-hmm.
right? I tell my clients and the people I work with, yes, I get HIPAA, but actually we've now gone past HIPAA. We shouldn't be implementing cybersecurity because of HIPAA. We should be doing it because of the world that we live in, right? And bad actors trying to get a hold of our data and trying to make money off of it. So that again should be a topic that board members are generally more interested in. Lorie, how about you? What would you suggest?
I think it's that transparent communication that I'm always a fan of. I think it's packaging up things in small bite size packages as much as you can. You're not going to probably get everything in that bite size, but I think when they're being onboarded as a board member, I think you need to make a plug to include at least something for compliance training. It doesn't have to be everything, because there is a dearth of information out there for board members if they want to go find it. But I think you have to give them the bare minimums, make sure they understand those three duties at a minimum. And I personally, I like giving them references to some case studies, the several nursing homes that you're aware of where the CFO or the CEO had a failure to disclose, or the board members that had conflicts of interest and didn't disclose, and use some of the big non-healthcare board failures
Mm,
as examples. I think Blockbuster, I think Enron, I think there's a sports company that had something like that. Use those as case studies, so it's not all about healthcare, but they understand as a board member, this is what you've signed up to do. Not
I
to
think that's a
scare them,
fantastic idea.
not to scare them. I'm not a big fan of scaring people, but again, you want to be transparent. You want to make sure that they understand and they have the opportunity to ask questions. Whoa, whoa, whoa. So you're saying this could happen if I don't do X? Give them that opportunity.
Hmm.
And I want to assume that there are a lot of fantastic board members out there, and this conversation is to help compliance professionals and boards work better together, not to build walls or
Hmm.
disparage a board at all. That is not the intent of
Nope.
this discussion. This discussion is about educating and trying to build
Hmm.
that bridge.
Hmm.
I'm all about building bridges and hiding under desks, but I think this is an opportunity where you can build that bridge to have a great conversation, but use those things out there. How many people have that image of Ken getting toted out in his handcuffs because there was a failure to disclose? That should be something you talk about. That is the absolute worst case scenario that should never happen. And it's so easy to avoid. Just do these three things. We'll be golden.
I read something that said, well, just do these three things and we'll be golden. So I don't think there's not like a magic, there's no magic wand or a magic key. And I
No.
like what you said about, you know, maybe breaking up the training and the education into bite-sized pieces and having like almost like a curriculum that you develop. That's
Yeah.
maybe a too big a word, but a plan for little bite-sized pieces that can be delivered online or in person,
Hmm.
but something to educate the board and also make sure that they understand what the role of compliance really is. I think there's a big misconception, and somewhere in the communication, there's maybe a perception that this compliance officer is just, they're just doing paperwork. They're hounding us for no particular reason,
Hmm.
no good reason. And there has to be something that changes about that perception. And as the compliance officer, sometimes you've got to work really hard to change that perception. Elvan, what were you going to say?
I think I was thinking both based on what you said and based on what Lorie said. I love what Lorie was saying, that it is all about building bridges. Here's the difference between me and Lorie. At this point, I'm burning bridges. But I was just thinking that in my head as a joke. But the reality of it is that, yes, we need to build those bridges, create these trainings, give opportunity. But when the opportunity shows itself to be delivered, but it's still not happening, maybe that's a sign as a company, that's a sign as a compliance officer to us to say, maybe this board member is not the best fit. Because if I feel like I'm cornering them for the simplest task that's going to ensure viability, what are the chances that they are going to me, that's a sign of a misfit. That's a sign of a misfit between that board member and maybe that company. I think that's the point where you say, okay, we tried to build this bridge, we try to provide the education, we try to get the paperwork to sign, but here we are at, after X many attempts, that we're just not able to get over that hump. So what are the chances that if they're not able to fulfill these little points for us, what are the chances that they're going to make the best choices on our behalf on the big decisions? I don't
And
know.
I've seen that. I've worked with organizations where we chose board members for, let's say, some specific expertise, let's say cybersecurity. and they weren't really interested. Like, you couldn't engage them, you couldn't get them to even attend board meetings. So an important part of fiduciary duty, I mean, compliance and fiduciary duty, they very much intersect. They're not 100% the same thing, but they completely intersect. And I don't see how that kind of board member can carry out or demonstrate their duty of care if
Mhm.
they're not engaged. And what are we talking about? What are these duties intended to do? They're there to protect the organization, right? And the compliance framework, as well as these duties, they are intended to protect the organization. And if the board members aren't informed or they're not engaged, and you can't get them to engage, it's impossible for them to carry out their duty of care, right? So you think you're right. At that point, it's about saying, well, wait a minute, are you the right fit for this organization? Right? Recognizing that everyone, again, there's that tension. How do you get board members? How do you attract board members? And there's no easy solution, but I do think the point that you made is very valid. So with that, I just wanted to understand, like, so we talked quite a bit actually around training, that can be rough. But the board, how can we help the board? We are talking about building bridges. We do ultimately want boards to be stronger and more
Mhm.
engaged. One way of doing that is education, but there are other ways of engaging the board. And I'd say that includes, and that's part of the obligation of the compliance officer, to include the board and give them sufficient data to make decisions. So, what kind
Mhm.
of data are we talking about? So, to my mind, data would be metrics on how the compliance program is working, information around compliance risks, maybe getting the board to buy into the compliance risk assessment, and even the compliance work plan. But making sure that board members understand there is such a thing as it can be that simple. There's a compliance work plan. Here are the 3 biggest activities that we're going to be working on throughout the year. These are the metrics we're going to use, and then you report on those metrics. But that's some of the data that you can provide to the board, compliance data that a compliance officer can provide to the board so that the board can make the decisions and discharge its duty of care. Do you think, ladies, that it's sufficient a lot of organizations have compliance committees,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right? Do you,
Correct.
and sometimes there's a subcommittee of the executive board, but not always.
Yeah.
Depends on the governance. But
Yes.
in either case, is it sufficient that the compliance committee is the only committee that's exposed to these conversations around compliance risk and metrics and work plan? Or do you think it should go a little higher to the general
Mhm.
board?
Mhm. Mhm. Even if it is a snippets to say, here are our findings, here is the plan, it should be no different than any other big decisions that has the influence of board members. If these are the right board members, they will ask the right questions and they will do more digging should there be a necessity. If the right answers are there and no further digging needs to happen, then that's that. But again, to me, yet again, that's a test of the right board member.
Yeah. How about you, Lori? What do you think?
Yeah, I generally think of it information flowing upward, but scaling it, right? So I think the rawest, most live take goes to your compliance or audit committee. You might have both, you might just have one, but you want to make sure they have the most information. And typically that's your C-suite, that's your senior directors, VPs, that kind of folks. And then when you get to the board, you want to take that same information, but maybe scale it just a little bit more refined. And then if they want more information, be prepared to give that to them, but keep it higher level because you're only getting minutes in front of the board, right? To give your entire 360 of your department. So you need to scale it. and make sure that it's bite-sized information. But if they want more, you've got the menu available that you can give them additional courses, so to speak.
Fair enough. And what about our smaller providers? Because a lot of people listen to this podcast and they come from different backgrounds and positions and organizations. I mean, not every organization, not every company
Yeah.
is big enough or complex enough to have a compliance committee. And that's okay. If you're a department, if you're a company of one or two,
Hmm.
you're a physician practice, you're probably not going to have a compliance committee. But what you can do is make sure that you are up to date, that if you're the only person running the business, that you have some sort of pipeline to compliance expertise, that you have a way of keeping yourself up to date, that maybe you still do an assessment of your risks and understand what risks need to be managed in your business, right? And make sure that you're getting some support and that you're not losing track of compliance. And for those who are a little bit bigger, where you have senior leadership, well, that's you still might not have a compliance committee. Maybe you're not big enough for that. That's okay.
Yeah.
But even still, think about what messages do you have to share with your senior leadership? What kind of engagement do you need to have with them? Right? And make sure that they are still involved in that decision making. Don't be put off by this. We've had a whole conversation around the board and that kind of leadership, but please don't be put off by that. What we really mean is whoever is responsible for the stewardship of the organization.
Hmm.
And many times it's a board, but maybe just as often it's not. It's a leadership team or it's the owner of a business. But the principles of our conversation really remain the same. Make sure that whoever is leading the organization understands they have a duty of care to protect the organization and make sure that the organization follows the rules and regulations of the industry. All right. And that actually failure to do so has all kinds of consequences. I wish I didn't have to talk about that bit, but obviously the OIG has felt that there's so much misunderstanding, or they find the issue of board and senior leadership around compliance to be maybe variable. That they put out a lot of guidance to make sure that folks understand the role of senior leadership and the role of stewarding an organization through its compliance obligations. Anything else, ladies?
We covered a good bit. I think it's up to the listeners to really ask the questions on this. And without mentioning company names, please bring us the questions that you're facing on this topic, because this is one of those topics that is talked about the best when we have real life examples in front of us. So I really would encourage the listeners to bring us some of their questions, that what they're facing on the topic, so we can give real guidance as to what would be the next best step. And if we cannot give that, we would be more than happy to brainstorm so that they can come up with their own next step.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. But like anything else, we learn from real examples. And sometimes it's hard to get your head around what
Yeah.
really happens, right? We all have these theoretical, but it's quite like a soap opera when you start to read the enforcement actions. It's amazing. But you hope that you don't have to get there, right? And one of the ways that we learn is by sharing our experiences and brainstorming potential ways of getting around some of those challenges. Something that I would add is, as we wrap up, something to keep in mind is I saw this, I can't take credit for this, right? I saw this written down and I thought it was absolutely a brilliant way to put it. So, our fiduciary duties sets out the why we're in these stewardship positions. We're there to act in the best interests of the organization, and compliance provides the how. So
Mm.
compliance provides the systems and the controls to ensure the lawful, ethical, and mission driven operations of the organizations. Boards that take compliance seriously, actually, you're helping the organization not just to avoid fines. Like, that's not really what it's about. Hopefully, if you're in a board position, you are there to help the organization be the best that it can be, to navigate challenges, right? To grow, to learn, to do the best that it can.
Mhm.
And you do that with compliance by asking regular questions about compliance, about challenging senior leadership, challenging the compliance officer. A lot of boards just sit there and they take in information, but an effective board doesn't do that. An effective board asks questions, challenges the information and the direction
Mhm.
that's being put in front of them, and that's all okay. And a strong board will want the compliance officer, will want to engage, will want that compliance officer to be independent,
Mhm.
right? And to be able to report to them independently in case there's something going on within the organization that that compliance officer either cannot raise or has raised and isn't being addressed.
Mhm.
So these are all really strong, good characteristics of a strong board. They might ask for documentation of compliance activities and risks. This is
And they
what a
should.
strong board, yes, they should. They should be looking at metrics. We're not saying Moby Dick. We're saying establish a set of metrics that the board is going to track and be able to comment on
Mhm.
and be able to then challenge and make choices and decisions based on those metrics, right? And also use compliance as a lens for decision making. This is a real thing for me. We don't have more time in this particular episode, but another time. But really using the expertise of compliance to look at decisions around mergers and acquisitions, around expansions, around vendor selection. There are so many opportunities to lean on the experience and the expertise of compliance that I don't think board members always pick up on, that really should be woven into that conversation.
Agreed.
All right. With all that to do about boards and senior leadership, I mean, I think it's a really great subject. It's a really touchy one. I know a lot of folks want to stay away from it, but I feel like it's a sensitive topic in so many organizations that it was worthwhile covering and really getting to the heart of where these obligations are coming from. And with that, ladies and listeners, I think we're going to call it a wrap for today. Hopefully, you've enjoyed the episode, picked up on something new. And as Elvan said, we're really interested in your feedback and your
Mhm.
comments and your experiences. So please, please, please do us a favor, share some of those experiences. We learn together and we do better together.
Absolutely.
All right. Then we
Agreed.
will see everyone next episode. All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care,
See you all
everyone. Bye
later. Bye
now.
bye.